So I kind of had a working title, really. All that singing's got my throat. Okay. Morning again, those of you who are online. I wasn't switched on. My working title is Countercultural Living. And we're thinking about Daniel as an example of countercultural living. So we're all citizens, aren't we? We're all citizens of a specific country. And because we're citizens of a country here on earth, our lives are bound by laws. But our lives are also, to some extent, dictated to by less defined aspects of culture. To be quite honest, some people are really experiencing this quite radically, aren't they, with this whole cancel culture that's going on. People who function online and put out their ideas online. And if they put out something that some people don't agree with, they get really bad things coming back at them. It's a massive thing right now, but it's always to some extent been defined by things like what is generally acceptable, what is generally valued, what's desirable, what's okay. You know, our lives are governed by those kind of things. And every now and again, we become conscious that there's a sort of shift in what we think of as public opinion. So there are attitudes and ideas which used to be generally accepted, and somehow they're no longer all right. All of a sudden, we sort of feel, oh, I suppose I better not say that anymore. We used to think that and say that, and I've got to be careful now. In the 2020 census, 56% of people said that they believed in a God, that's any God, or higher power. And that is lower than any previous census. And that would have an influence on what we call culture. You know, the way people think and live, and what their priorities are, and what their values are, how they make decisions about what's right or wrong, what's okay, what's not okay. And all this means that there will be times, as Christians, there should be times when what seems to be the general opinion around us will go against what we believe as Christians. And there will be times, there should be times when we should be willing to be counter-cultural, to swim against the tide, to stand up and stand out for God's ways, for his honor, and very specifically for justice. And maybe this is what we need to be willing for. Well, definitely, personally, in our private groups, families and groups we meet with, and maybe publicly in some way. So I've got a bit of a PowerPoint to help us get a few things in our mind, and this is PowerPoint 1. I hope that's okay. And what I'm saying is that we need to realize, we need to have a real understanding that we are citizens of heaven. We are bound by different laws and attitudes and perspectives and values. Our King died to save us. The law of love is above all. And this is bound to put us into conflict at times with earthly authority and thinking. Now, all of this is by no means straightforward, and it has to be said with the benefit of hindsight, the church has not always got this right, and we don't always get this right. It's complicated. Sometimes we choose the wrong cause to fight, and sometimes we go about things in the wrong way or with an unhelpful attitude, and that's where I think that old Daniel, well, young Daniel actually, but he lived a long time ago, can help. So I want to go to Daniel chapter 1, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 7. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, Nebuchadnezzar said. Make sure they're well versed in every branch of learning and gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter royal service. This was full immersion in an alien culture. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah Shadrach, Mishael Meshach, and Azariah called Abednego. It is not possible to exaggerate how much of a culture shock that must have been for Daniel and his friends. Even their names are taken from them. Their names, so much a symbol of their identity. How lost these teenagers must have felt. How very out of sync with the general culture that they were being immersed in. And let's not imagine that because they were privileged somehow, because they were picked out for special treatment, which in a sense, well, certainly Nebuchadnezzar thought they were, there's perhaps no place so dangerous as the court of a despotic tyrant who could order heads to roll on any whim, and often did. So I'm going to read on a little bit, carrying on at verse 8. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat his food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. It's just the way things are at court these days. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. And at the end of 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food, and then make your decision in the light of what you see. And this attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of that time, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better eating the food than those assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and the wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them on any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters of his entire kingdom. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus, and that was 4 kings later. Do you know, I think there are 3 principles which we can pull out from this example of Daniel to help us think about how do we be citizens of heaven while we're living here on earth. What did Daniel do in this entirely alien culture? Number 1, have we got PowerPoint 2 up? Number 1, are they not? Okay. Number 1, Daniel consciously remembered where his true citizenship lay. He knew who he was. Despite having been robbed of his Jewish name, he knew he was part of the children of Israel, and as such, he was in covenant relationship with God. PowerPoint 2, please. No, that's right. Oh, is that right? Is that the right one? Consciously remembered who he was. Is that it? This involved keeping the food laws. Now, I'm not going to go into details about that. Let's just take that as read within the context of what we're looking at this morning, okay? He knew for him that was a red line. And he picked that issue to make his stand very early on. Secondly, second principle that Daniel worked with was he made whatever stand he was going to make politely, appropriately, and reasonably. He didn't create unnecessary confrontation. He was bold, but he wasn't belligerent. It was really interesting, wasn't he? The chief of staff said, I can't do this. I'm scared for my neck. And Daniel quietly went to the chap who actually bought the food, and he managed to get him on side. So he took a risk. It was bold. And number 3, Daniel kept, and perhaps this is most important of all, in very close relationship with God, leaning on God for strength to do what was right. And we know this in 2 ways. 1, you can't receive gifts from someone you're not close to. And God gave special gifts to Daniel and his friends. And secondly, we find later on that Daniel, everybody knew, Daniel went 3 times a day to pray. He went quietly, but he went openly. He had the window open towards Jerusalem. He had a habit of devotion. They're the 3 principles. And there are 6 recorded incidents where Daniel and or his friends really had to make a stand throughout the next few chapters. In the most dangerous of situations, they behaved counterculturally. They stood against what everyone was doing and thinking. And every single time you see, if you read carefully, he's using those 3 principles. He remembered who he was. He did what he did politely and reasonably. And he kept in close relationship with God. And the situations got scarier and scarier. So we're just going to think about one, and just quite briefly, really. The first one. So Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He wakes up very troubled. He calls for his advisors to tell him 2 things. He says to them, what did I dream? Tell me the content of my dream, and then interpret it. Unsurprisingly, they can't do that. They say that's absolutely ridiculous. Nobody on earth could do that. And Nebuchadnezzar says, right, that's it. Execute the lot. And that's not just the ones he called, that was everybody. That would include Daniel and his friend. It was like Boris Johnson deciding to, expel or even execute the whole government and the senior civil service. No doubt there are a couple he'd like to get rid of, but, we won't go there. At this point, Daniel knew he had to step up. This was a massive injustice. He couldn't let it happen. And there's just a few verses I'm going to read about this from chapter 2, verse 14. So when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to kill them all, Daniel handled the situation with wisdom and discretion. He didn't panic. He asked Arioch, why has the king issued such a harsh decree? So Arioch told him all that had happened, and Daniel went at once to see the king and requested more time to tell the king what the dream meant. Think about those principles I talked about. Then Daniel went home and told his friends what had happened. He urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret so they would not be executed along with all the other wise men of Babylon. That night, the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And then Daniel praised the God of heaven. And he said, praise the name of God forever and ever. For he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness, though he is surrounded by light. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. He knew who he was. For you have given me wisdom and strength. You've told me what we asked of you and revealed what the king demanded. It's wonderful, isn't it? It's amazing also to see that even when he spoke to Nebuchadnezzar the megalomaniac, he was respectful. That was quite wise in the circumstances. We never see Daniel right the way through acting out of a sense of being in a position of power. There's never arrogance. Even though he was in a position of power here, he had the answer to the dream. He never acts out of that. And just to demonstrate, this comes again and again. In chapter 2 again, verse 28, this is what he said when he went to Nebuchadnezzar to interpret the dream. He said, he repeated basically what the original wise men had said to the king. He said, there are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven. But there is a God in heaven. He remembered who he was. And he always gave God the glory. And what we find as we go through these chapters of Daniel and his friends, through a long period of time, living counterculturally and basically working and trying to stay alive in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar and then Belshazzar and then Darius and Cyrus, they grew in faith in God and in knowledge of God and in relationship with him and in courage. So that when they were in danger, Daniel's friends of being thrown into that fiery furnace for not going with the crowd and bowing down to a golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar, they are able to assert, and this is chapter 3, verses 16 to 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, when Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't bow down, you'll go in there, you'll die. They said, O Nebuchadnezzar, still polite and respectful, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the golden statue you have set up. This is challenging, isn't it? Really challenging. As I've been thinking about this issue and challenging myself, what am I willing to do? What do I do? Do I just keep my head down and just get on with life and hope Nobody notices. There's two things that I just think are quite interesting that feed into this. One is, basically, I think, I don't know if I said there were 6 times that are recorded when they did stand up. But basically, they didn't fight everything every day. They knew they were in an alien culture, but mostly Daniel knuckled down, did a jolly good job for a very long time. His success was noticed and rewarded, actually, even though at times, he got into trouble. He also had success. He got on with most people around him. He became a trusted person. He adapted to different situations. He wasn't an angry, discontented, or judgmental person. He was strong in the strength of the Lord. He didn't throw his position around. He didn't throw his power around. And most importantly, there is evidence, actually, that others were so impressed that they acknowledged Daniel's God as the one true God. And Darius and Cyrus were the kings who facilitated the return to Jerusalem under Nehemiah and Ezra. And I can't help thinking that Daniel's long example of devotion to God underpinned that change of heart that came about. By that time, I think it was the Persian Empire, wasn't it? I think. And the second thing that I kind of just noticed that is interesting to think about is that for Daniel, being countercultural didn't involve retreating into a religious bubble, a safe place. That would have been easy, wouldn't it? I expect there were plenty of Jews throughout Babylon who didn't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar, but they weren't important people, so they weren't noticed. But Daniel was up there in the court, and his friends were, and so they were noticed. He was thoroughly in his culture, whilst standing out and up when necessary. It's challenging. And as we navigate living as citizens of heaven whilst being properly engaged in our earthly culture, and we try to work out, how do I truly honor God in a godless world? As we try to work out what we should stand up for and when and how, especially over issues of justice, well, I just really think that there are things we can do, that Daniel's example can really help us. And I'm not going in this morning, I'm not really thinking too much about specifics in terms of what we should stand up for and how we should do it, writing letters to our MP or going on marches or signing petitions, or how we should function in our groups when we somehow feel we should say something that's a bit not okay anymore. I'm kind of not going to do that, but I'm really going to give some good questions and pointers in the notes that I do for use in your life groups, so that in smaller groups you can really perhaps tease some of that stuff out. And I'm also, I hope we're on PowerPoint 4, I want to bring to your attention an organisation which you might have heard of, I don't know. Andy, I know, reads this a lot, and I do read it too, called Voice for Justice. And in doing so, I'm speaking personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of Glendale as a whole, and I'm not saying that I always necessarily understand, or certainly I don't always feel comfortable, but then they talk about issues which are not comfortable. I did read one this morning about abortion. I don't always feel comfortable with their tone and so on. But it's a really good Christian organisation, and it has some really well-qualified people who are running it and who are patrons of it, people who are respected people. It's really, really worth a look at. I'll direct you to that as well on my notes. So I just want to finish with some lines of poetry by Malcolm Guite. So we think about who we are, and we remember that we're citizens of heaven, and we shouldn't always go with the flow here on earth. We dance to tunes the world has never heard, for you put heaven's music in our hearts. The stance of praise is radical. It cuts through chance and change, for we keep heaven's time. God give us the strength, the willingness, the grace to be citizens of heaven as we live here on earth. Amen.